Now I have the privilege of introducing my very good friend and a person for whom I have huge admiration. Rabbi Or Rose, among other things, is a father and husband who adores his family. He's a person who loves his students, who works very closely with them over many years, long after they graduate, and he is the founding director of the Miller Center for Interreligious Learning and Leadership of Hebrew College. He is one of the interreligious leaders of this country and has been for many years. And the interesting opportunities that he stirred up in the Boston region have changed the landscape of interreligious and interfaith relationships. He's the author of a new book, a biography for young adults. And the name of the book, My Legs Were Praying, a biography of Abraham Joshua Heschel. This is what he's going to share with us today. And I want you to know a little bit about his background prior to this book, because he has done a lot of writing. And you'll notice as I read some of the titles, he has been very concerned with spirituality, with justice, and with interreligious relationships. And he weaves those together in incredible ways. Let me just read some of the titles so that you will get an idea. But before I go there, let me say that he stirs up things. So he stirs up interreligious work in conferences, courses, retreats, special events, very, very often, most often, with Jewish, Muslim, and Christian collaboration. Early on, he co-founded what they call the Circle, which was a collaborative learning center with Hebrew College and Andover Newton Theological School. And since then, he's continued to develop special programs with Boston College, Boston University, and other organizations around the country. So now some of his books, which will give you a flavor for the kinds of things he really cares about. With the Best of Intentions, and the subtitle for this one, Interreligious Missteps and Mistakes. Another one, Jewish Mysticism in the Spiritual Life. Rabbi Zalman Schachter, Deep Understanding for Divisive Times. Righteous Indignation, with the subtitle, A Jewish Call for Justice. God in All Moments, subtitle, Mystical and Practical Spiritual Wisdom from Hasidic Masters. My Neighbor's Faith, Stories of Interreligious Encounter. You get the sense of who Or is from those titles, but who he really is in his person. And you're going to get a sense of someone who is spiritually deep, brilliant in his ways of thinking, and a doer, a go-getter who makes things happen. Or thank you so much for being with us. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Mary Elizabeth. It is always an honor and a pleasure to be in your company. I consider you both a friend and a mentor, and your gracious words are very meaningful to me. And I'm honored, too, to be able to share with all of you my recent work on Abraham Joshua Heschel. I'll share my screen in a moment and delve into the substance of my remarks. But before doing so, I want to also thank this community, because I know that my parents, Rabbi Neil and Carol Rose, dip in and out of it, and it has been a real source of spiritual sustenance to them. So thank you for creating this sacred vessel for conversation together. So as Mary Elizabeth said, the title of my recent book is called My Legs Were Praying, a biography of Abraham Joshua Heschel. And the title itself comes from words that Heschel shared with the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. following their marching together from Selma to Montgomery in 1965. And I was inspired to write this book because I think that young people need models. They need examples of human beings, historical and contemporary, that are dedicated to spirituality and to social justice. In Heschel's case, of course, as we will learn, these things emerged out of several very significant life experiences, both in Europe and the United States. To set the table, as it were, just so that we're on the same footing, I want to start with this thumbnail sketch, this biographical overview of Heschel's life, so you get a sense of some of the influences, some of the ways in which he wove together the strands of his experience. Heschel was born in 1907 in Warsaw, Poland. He was the offspring of several generations of Hasidic masters, that is, mystically oriented, charismatic teachers. And it was expected of him by his Hasidic community that he would be the next great master in this very well-known and honored family. And while he took the teachings and the traditions of Hasidism very seriously, as a teenager also he was moved by the diversity of Jewish and cultural expression in Warsaw. It was, of course, a cosmopolitan city. And so as he made his way through the cobblestone streets of that city, he discovered different expressions of Jewish thought and practice. And that led him as a teenager, after being ordained, I should add, as a rabbi at the age of 14 or 15, to attend a gymnasium, a modern Jewish high school in Vilna, which was several hours away from his birthplace and childhood home in Warsaw. That led him to Berlin, where at Humboldt University, he undertook doctoral studies. It was in that context where he began his lifelong project on the prophets. He wrote that project at the university while also simultaneously training for a second time for rabbinic ordination, this time at the Hochschule, at the liberal seminary. His first book that he published was not a theological treatise, but a collection of poetry. And the title of that collection, I think, is important to understanding the trajectory of the rest of Heschel's life. It was written in Yiddish, which is interesting in itself because it was both his Mama Loshen, it was the language of his childhood experience, but also the language that various avant-garde young poets were using in Jewish Europe at the time. The title is, in Hebrew or Yiddish, Der Shem HaMeforash, that is, God's ineffable name, or the Tetragrammaton, Mensch, which means the human being or man. And what Heschel, of course, was articulating was the deep conviction that God's creativity is to be found uniquely in every person. Ironically and tragically, that collection of poetry appeared in 1933, and I need not explain to you that there were other world events unfolding at the same time in that very same location. And so that was the year that Hitler came to power. And Heschel's experience as a doctoral student was completely upended. And his Jewish advisors were replaced by Christian scholars that were sympathetic to Hitler's emerging vision. And so it became very difficult for him to finish that program. While doing so, he also taught in the Jewish community and published other works, including a slim volume on Maimonides, on the Rambam, which was for a popular audience. Heschel moved in 1937. It doesn't appear here, but he moved in 1937 at the invitation of one Martin Buber, who was one of the great Jewish thinkers of the era, from Berlin to Frankfurt to work on the project of adult Jewish education. And when Buber took leave in 1937 for Mandate Palestine, Heschel took over and co-led this center for a year or so, until 1938, when he was unceremoniously booted out of the country, along with thousands of other Poles. He arrived at the Polish border after a harrowing journey by train, standing most of the time for 3 or more days. And because his family was a prominent one, his freedom was secured within a few days. Many people spent weeks or months along that border in terrible conditions. And of course, that was just the beginning of the horrors for Polish Jewry. When he arrived home, he applied for positions far and wide and was given a lifeline in the form of a scholar's visa by Hebrew Union College, the flagship center for Reform Judaism in the United States. It was, as you can imagine, a very difficult decision to leave Poland because he alone was given that scholar's visa. But the rest of his family, that is his mother and his sisters, who remained in Poland, and of course his extended family and his friends and his teachers, were not given such opportunities. And so he had to leave alone. He had an older brother that lived in London, England, and so he took refuge there until the paperwork was finalized and he moved to Cincinnati. He was forever grateful that he had been saved by Hebrew Union College, but was a more traditional Jew in his practice than the vast majority of faculty and students at HUC in Cincinnati. And so soon after arriving in the United States, began a conversation with administrators and faculty at the Jewish Theological Seminary, the Center for Conservative Judaism in New York, about teaching there. And in fact, he did from 1945 until the end of his life in 1972. I think it is fair to say that at JTS, Heschel also didn't quite fit. And I'll return to that in a few moments. But at the seminary, Heschel spent much of his time working on theological projects and more popular religious works, while most of his colleagues were involved in philological, historical, critical research for other scholars. He married Sylvia Strauss in 1946, whom he first met in Ohio. And Sylvia was a concert pianist and the child of refugees from Europe. And that is an important part of Heschel's social world. He spent a lot of time with refugees and scholars. He published his first book in English, which was not his first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, or seventh language. The Earth is the Lord's. And that is a slim volume that he first delivered as an oral presentation in Yiddish at YIVO, the Society for the Preservation of Yiddish Culture, which had been transplanted from Warsaw and Vilna to New York City. And according to lore, while the audience was largely secular, when Heschel finished this Kaddish, if you will, this memorial to Eastern European religious life with a specific focus on Hasidism, people stood and said the memorial prayer together, the Kaddish for the dead together spontaneously. Heschel has one child, that being Susanna Heschel, who is now Professor Susanna Heschel and is, of course, an outstanding scholar and activist in her own right. In 1952, he published what many considered to be his theological opus, God in Search of Man. 1962, a decade later, he published the English expansion of his doctoral dissertation, The Prophets. And as we'll see, Heschel considered that to be the inspiration for his activism. He became a much more public figure, a much more socially engaged figure in the United States in the last decade of his life, including, of course, his involvement with King and others in the civil rights movement. In 1963, in fact, he spoke at the Conference on Religion and Race, and that was the first time that he met Dr. King. They became close friends soon after. It was also during that time where he served as an advisor to the Second Vatican Council, which produced the historic document Nostra Aetate. 65 is when he marched for African-American voting rights from Selma to Montgomery. In some ways, his most audacious leadership in terms of social justice commitments was the role he played in the establishment of Cal-Cav, which many of you, I'm sure, are aware of and know about, through some of your own teachers or colleagues or older friends. That was the anti-Vietnam War organization. In fact, it was Heschel that helped to convince King to join that group in 1967. Heschel dies in 1972 at the very young age of 65. When you look at the photograph on the right-hand side of the page, you might guess that he was much older than that. It's a beautiful portrait of him. I think part of the reason why he looked so old is because of the very dramatic life that he lived, including a lot of pain and a whole slew of challenges. Thank God that most of us do not have to face. But in thinking about his legacy today, and specifically for younger people, but not exclusively for younger people, for all of those that are young at heart, I wanted to try and isolate 5 elements that I think are important. And I've been trying to refine this as I speak on the book. The first is the cultivation of personal authenticity. The second is this notion that we are needed by God. I think that will be of particular interest to the process crowd. The third is what I call, based on a midrash, an ancient Jewish parable, the Bira Doleket, the palace that is aflame or illuminated. The notion that the world is both broken and beautiful. The fourth is the aspiration for integration, both for internal and external healing or mending, tikkun. And then the last of these, which I think is so important in this moment, that pathos and interdependence abide. So those are 5 points that I want to share with you, and I want to share some quotations and commentary on those quotations in the next 25 minutes or so, and then open things to conversation. You'll see that I chose as the photograph on this page Heschel's first book, that book of poetry, translated by one of his students and colleagues, Morton Leifman. And you can see that the picture on the cover of this translation is of the streets of Warsaw, where Heschel began writing that poetry as a teenager. And then the last book that he published, A Passion for Truth, which was a comparative study of the Rebbe from Kotsk, the great 19th century Hasidic reformer, and the Danish theologian Søren Kierkegaard. And that gives you a sense of the arc, if you will, of Heschel's commitments. So the first of these points is articulated, I think, beautifully by Heschel when, in speaking to young people, he says the following: "It is through the awareness that I am not only and everybody that I evolve as a somebody, as a person, as something that cannot be repeated, for which there is no duplicate, no substitute. It is in the awareness of my being somebody that freedom comes to pass." And I love that he ends the quotation with this notion that in recognizing my individuality, my uniqueness, that there is the emergence of a sense of freedom. That given who I am, my strengths and talents, also my limits and my challenges, that I have a range of choices. They're not infinite, but I have a range of choices. And for Heschel, of course, the next question will be, what will you do with the choices before you? I also want to call your attention to the images on the screen, and then I'll read the second quotation from Genesis Rabbah. The far left is the frontispiece from the collection of homilies that Heschel's namesake, his great-great-grandfather, the first Abraham Joshua Heschel, wrote, and the name of the book also telegraphs who the younger Heschel, that is Professor Heschel, will become generations later. It's called Sefer Ohev Yisrael, and Ohev Yisrael means the lover of the people of Israel. And his great-great-grandfather was renowned as both a mystic and a teacher. And he was a person that was remembered above and beyond his erudition and spiritual depth, a person that was someone that loved and cared for his community. And that is a part of the legacy that Heschel inherited. But he couldn't remain, for a variety of reasons, in the discovery of who he was as a somebody within the bounds of traditional Hasidic life. That's the young Heschel. That's another translation of the poetry to the right of that picture. He wasn't born with a long, white, flowing beard. That came later. But that in itself, right, is a statement about his own choices. He married rather late. That's a picture of him and Sylvia. You see that he was the scholar Heschel. You know, that's his office at Jewish Theological Seminary. But again, could not simply remain in his office. And the final one of those photographs is of him protesting on behalf of Jews in the former Soviet Union. He, along with Elie Wiesel, were instrumental in beginning that movement for the freedom of Soviet Jewry. And for Heschel, it was bound up in his commitments to civil rights in the United States. And he became active in both of those causes at roughly the same time. I wanted to give you that brief tour of these images, a kind of gallery walk, if you will, virtually, because one of the things that I think is important to understand about Heschel is that he was an iconoclast. And iconoclasm, as you all know, in your own life journeys, has its consequences. And I think that's stated very powerfully in this midrashic source about the first Abraham, the biblical Abraham, where it says that Abraham was an Ivri in the book of Genesis. Rabbi Yehuda midrashically points out that the word Ivri can be understood as a person that stands across, over against. So the entire world is on one side, and he, that is Abraham, is on the other side, me'ever. And it's a play on the Hebrew term for Ivri, for a member of that tribe. And that was Heschel. On the one hand, he was a person that moved through many different circles, really moved through different worlds of discourse, of scholarship, and of action, but never quite fit neatly or easily in any of them. And as I said before, that included JTS, where he was more of a popular writer among more conventional scholars, where he was quite often among the more progressive political voices on the faculty, where he was also a chassid among misnagdim, which means that people took with them from Eastern and Central Europe their various Jewish roots and allegiances, which included a divide between the Hasidim and their opponents, between mystics and those that were more rationally minded, etc. So all of those things were at play. And so Heschel was trying to stitch together, I think, with an unusual degree of authenticity, a life that was all his own. And it sometimes left him feeling alone, lonely, and searching out, fellow travelers. And so that included an eclectic bunch. It included Reinhold Niebuhr. It included William Sloane Coffin. It included, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. It included Wiesel, with whom he studied Hasidic sources on Shabbat afternoons. It included others that came from Jewish European backgrounds. It included artists and musicians, especially those connected to him through his wife's world of music. So that's the first point. The second point flows from this, at least in my mind and heart, which is, as I said before, once Heschel articulates this notion of personal freedom, of authenticity, of the discovery of the range of choices, the next question that he asks, of course, is what is demanded of us, to use his language? That is, what is at stake in your life and the choices you make? For Heschel, that means there is a divine impingement. The reason why he calls that great work God in Search of Man is because he believed very deeply that anytime we have a quote unquote spiritual impulse or inkling, that is a response to the divine call, that God is searching out human beings, like the still small voice from the story of Elijah the prophet in the Hebrew Bible. And Heschel, rooting himself thoroughly in Jewish mystical sources, made use of this notion that Nachmanides, not to be confused with Maimonides, articulated in the medieval period, which is God, in fact, is in need of humankind. And you can see the quotation here. Man is man because something divine is at stake in his existence. He's not an innocent bystander in the cosmic drama. There is in us more kinship with the divine than we are able to believe. And then he quotes from the book of Proverbs and talks about the ways in which we are the candles of the Lord, that it is our task to serve as partners, to use rabbinic language, shutafim, in the ongoing project of the creation of a compassionate, just, and sustainable world. And that leads me to this third point, which is a text that Heschel really loved and quoted often, including in God in Search of Man, which is where I first saw it. It's another text about Abraham, not surprisingly, because Abraham serves as a model of the spiritual seeker in Judaism. And so in this case, the question that the rabbis ask is, who was Abram before he is Abraham? Who was Abram? And why was it that God chose him and not somebody else? Why is he commissioned? What made him special? And so the rabbis create a whole backstory, if you will, about who Abram was. And they say that Abram can be compared to a man traveling from place to place who comes upon a birah doleket. And as so often the case in Hebrew, this term can be understood differently. Part of what Heschel loved about it. Could it be, asks the traveler, that there is no one to care for the palace? Birah means palace or tower. The owner looks out at him and says, I am the master of the palace. Similarly, says the rabbinic voice, Abraham, our father, wondered, could it be that there was no one who cares for the world? At that moment, the Blessed Holy One looked out and said to him, I am the master of the world. And I think that Heschel loved this text because you can read doleket, that second Hebrew word, as being either aglow or on fire. The world is either illuminated or it is burning up. And I think Heschel understood that both were true. He understood that not only historically, but also personally from his life journey. And I think also as he talks about it in God in Search of Man, here the divine, that is the owner of the palace in the allegory, announces himself, but doesn't say to the traveler, don't worry, I'm going to resolve everything. You need not engage. Just enjoy the beauty of the world. And don't worry about the flames that might consume you and others. And so Heschel reads this as an invitation. right? He reads this as a very deliberate statement about God's presence, but the responsibility of humankind to join God in either putting out the fire or increasing the light, as it were. And so I paired it in this case with this verse from Exodus 25:8, Ve'asuli mikdash v'shachanti betocham, where God says, in the context of the building of the tabernacle, make for me, right, Moses and the children of Israel, a sanctuary. That is, you make the sanctuary and I will dwell among you. And so that, to me, is a powerful statement about the model of cooperative and creative work, divine and human. And Heschel himself articulates this, to return to my point a moment ago. When he spoke as the first visiting Jewish professor at Union Theological Seminary in 1965, where he took the long walk across the street from the Jewish Theological Seminary, in his public address there, which he called appropriately, No Religion is an Island, he said in his opening remarks, I speak as a person who was able to leave Warsaw, the city in which I was born, just 6 weeks before the disaster began. My destination was New York City. It would have been Auschwitz or Treblinka. I am a brand plucked from the fire in which my people were burned to death. And he lived with that the rest of his life. He carried that. I'm sure it felt like it was something that he carried very heavily many days, knowing that he was a brand plucked from the fires. And at the same time, in the last interview that he granted, he turned and wanted to address young people. And he said, remember that there is a meaning beyond absurdity. Build life as if it were a work of art. Remember that life is a celebration. He certainly was not denying the absurdities of life. How could he, after his experiences in Germany, after escaping the Blitzkrieg by 6 weeks? And at the same time, he was also the person who insisted that the world is suffused with God's beauty, that we must be aware of, right, God's presence. He is, after all, right, the person who coined the term radical amazement to describe walking along the streets of New York City, of Central Park and of Riverside Park, and of observing the sunset, etc. So again, I think these photographs probably say as much or more as the words on the page. To the far left is his mother, who was responsible for raising him after Heschel's father died at a young age. Just before Heschel's 10th birthday, his father died from influenza as it was sweeping through Eastern Europe. And his mother was a very important figure. Tragically, she died when Nazi officers came to their family home. They knocked on the door and she had a heart attack. The next picture is a rather dramatic one. It's Heschel. He's second to the left. He has a full head of hair and does not yet have a beard, wearing glasses. He is a part of a group of 10 scholars that were saved by Hebrew Union College. And this is their gathering in 1942 when they had all arrived to Cincinnati. It's an amazing photograph. One can only imagine what it was like to sit in that room with 9 other refugee scholars. And all of the stories, all of the pain, all of the hope that they carried with them. The next picture is of Heschel smiling. He looks, very much like he's enjoying his classroom. This is from 1972 at JTS, near the end of his life. By this point, he looks very much like the prophetic figure that people saw him as and the persona that he cultivated. And then, of course, on the other side from his mother is a picture of the late, great John Lewis walking arm in arm with his daughter, Susanna Heschel. So that's the arc of his life, the fire and the light. The fourth piece is what I described earlier, and using language that's probably familiar to many of you, is this notion of tikkun. And I think Heschel embodied that so beautifully. Prayer is no panacea, he says, no substitute for action. It is rather like a beam thrown from a flashlight before us into the darkness. It is in this light that we grope, stumble, and climb to discover where we stand, what surrounds us, and the course which we should choose. Prayer makes visible the right and reveals the false. In its radiance, we behold the worth of our efforts, the range of our hopes, and the meaning of our deeds. This is a quotation from Heschel's work on prayer. He was a great advocate of prayer. And he understood, and this comes from his Hasidic background, that to pray and then to separate that from the rest of life was tragic, was really an abomination. And so he sought to weave together his spiritual and activist sensibilities, which is why it's important for me to point out that it was the same Abraham Joshua Heschel who wrote the prophets and the Sabbath. For Heschel, there was no dichotomy between the ritual aspects of life and the prophetic need to engage in activism. It's also the reason, can you still see my screen? Yes? Okay. It's also the reason why I put here these photographs, one of Heschel, of course, marching from Selma to Montgomery, and the other is a rare photograph that one of his nephews gave me for the book of Heschel's uncle, who you can see bears a resemblance to his nephew. Also a short, stout man, walking through the streets of Warsaw with one of his Hasidim, with one of his younger disciples. Because for Heschel, these things were absolutely related. His experiences walking through the streets of Warsaw was a model for him of what it meant to be among people of spiritual nobility. And that's exactly what he said when he returned from the march from Selma to Montgomery. He said, I felt as if my legs were praying. I felt as if I was engaged in embodied prayer and activism. And he further stated in a diary entry that he felt like he was again in the company of people of spiritual nobility, like those people from his youth. Even though those people, of course, couldn't make the same set of connections that Heschel was making across Jewish and Christian, European and American, Black and white. He was extraordinary in that regard, but you also see some of the sources, theological and experiential, that lent to his unique synthesis, this kind of Heschelian synthesis, which has become a model for so many, including myself, in groping towards being the people that we wish to be. And I love that description of prayer. Prayer is a place in which we reflect, we discern. It is, how do we want to be in the world? Who must we be in the world? Here I want to move to the example, in some ways, par excellence of this kind of embodied thinking. This way of piecing together the spiritual and the activist. It's in this telegram, which I've written about in depth, but I'll just point out it's a telegram that Heschel sent to JFK a day before a meeting at the White House of religious leaders from across the country, and a week before the meeting of civil rights leaders and JFK to discuss what would become the March on Washington, the great March on Washington. And as you see here, Heschel plays the role of spiritual and ethical gadfly with great poetic precision. The line that I think is most important in this context is, we forfeit the right to worship God as long as we continue to humiliate Negroes. There can be no divorce between our prayer lives and our ethical responsibilities. He goes on, of course, to call for a state of moral emergency in the United States. And he proposes that the president call for a Marshall Plan to aid to Negroes. And part of what Heschel, of course, is doing here is he's trying to appeal to the first Catholic president of the United States, who himself had experienced great bias and bigotry, and saying to him that there is a collective responsibility, that synagogues and churches have failed, and that this is a time for sacrifice, for contrition. And of course, the last words are moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. Chutzpah, holy chutzpah, is what Heschel is calling for. And you see a copy of the original document on the right-hand side, which Susanna very generously donated a copy of to my wife's organization, the Jewish Women's Archive, as it's a source of inspiration to Susanna as a feminist activist. The last of these quotations that I want to share with you comes from the substance, The Body of No Religion is an Island, from which I read earlier. And it's about pathos and interdependence. The supreme issue today is not the halacha for the Jew or the church for the Christian, but the premise underlying both religions, namely whether there is a pathos, a divine reality concerned with the destiny of man, which mysteriously impinges upon history. The supreme issue is whether we are alive or dead to the challenge and the expectation of the living God. Our era marks the end of complacency, the end of evasion, the end of self-reliance. Jews and Christians share the same perils and fears. Interdependence of political and economic conditions all over the world is a basic fact of our situation. Parochialism has become untenable. And this is a call, of course, to religious folks to pick up on the fact of interdependence. It is his message to us religious people, so-called, to understand that we, as Dr. King said it, are indebted to a whole range of people before we even leave our homes in the morning. In Dr. King's award-winning speech, when he received the Nobel Prize, he said, just think about what it means to awaken each day and the basic activities that are involved in washing your hands and face, brushing your teeth, having your first cup of coffee or tea, and all of the people around the world that were involved in helping you do that. Who made the soap? Who ground the coffee? Who fill in the blanks when it comes to all of the basics? And that is the context in which Dr. King spoke about the world house. And this is very much akin to that statement. So those are the 5 elements that I wanted to share with you, and I hope this will open us to conversation. And again, I want to thank Mary Elizabeth specifically for this invitation to share my work, and I'd love to hear your reflections, questions, or comments. The last of the slides that I shared feels particularly poignant. We are still interdependent, and we are in desperate need of pathos, of what Heschel's forebears would call chesed, loving kindness, or rachmanut, mercy. He was not naive or Pollyannish about deep commitments to different religious and ideological facts of life. but you hear him desperately calling for what he describes in the same essay as the development of a pluralistic ethics. So I'll end here, and I'm happy to engage in conversation as folks wish to do so.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was a very moving presentation, Or. And your closing slide focused on pathos went to the center. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
We have